Welcome to Aunty K's, your favorite radical queer indigenous auntie, bringing you tarot every day. Hello and welcome to Aunty K's Tarot. Today, I have with me my friend Mohamed Abdou, who wrote the book Islam and Anarchism, and we are going to be discussing this book today, the contents of this book, and I feel pretty certain that this discussion will also overlap with and relate to the current genocide and apartheid that Palestinians are facing. And so let us get into it. Mohamed, I suppose I should introduce myself for people who might find this based on its title. I am Krista Demore Flute. I'm Lakota and Cajun 60s scoop survivor who was internally displaced from South Dakota to Ontario, currently in Algonquin territories. Mohamed, do you like to introduce yourself, please?
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah. First of all, thank you for having me, my sister. My name is Mohamed Abdou. I'm a scholar organizer. And yeah, I'm a settler of color on Turtle Island, originally of Egyptian North African descent. I moved to Turtle Island and became a settler when I was 17 in 1997. Currently, I'm talking to you from Egypt, the wellspring of sort of, Tahrir and the so-called Arab Spring and Pan-Arab and Pan-Islamist thought. I'm currently a professor at Columbia. I just finished my postdoc at land grab and science Cornell. Cornell's, the largest land grab university, arguably in the world. But let's just stick to Turtle Island. In acres of stolen land, over 250 indigenous nations whose lands have been stolen and who are evicted from their lands vis-a-vis the Morella Act. It's also a Zionist institution, given its collaboration with company Techneon, which is an Israeli arms manufacturer, and so Cornell is very much entwined in indigenous Palestinian or native Palestinian dispossession, because it assists in the making of the very weapons that displace Palestinians off land, as well as roof knock strikes, for instance, that allow Palestinians a minute or two to supposedly evacuate their living homes and to pack their belongings, which is rather ridiculous and inhumane when it gets named as roof knock strikes. But nonetheless, I've been a social movement participant and sort of organizer post Seattle in 1999, the anti-globalization protests in Seattle, the anti-Iraq and Afghanistan war on terror. It's actually a war on Islam and a war within Islam, crusading war. I've been involved with the Zatistas, obviously with Tahrir Square, so actual revolutions, abolitionist groups, queer feminist groups over the course of decades, Mohawk land defending and indigenous land defending, as I was living in Turtle Island. And yeah, I'll be moving to Lenni, Lenape, and Wappinger People's Territory when I move back to New York City. So yeah, it's that's a little bit of background about myself, and obviously I'm an Arab, a self-identifying Arab, and more importantly a Muslim. So,
and we met during one of my many reincarnations in organizing, and you helped bring the indigenous organizing in Kingston together with SPHR, the Support Palestinian Human Rights, which led to many years while I was there of collaborative affiliate organizing that expanded out from those two groups. And so, some parts of this book were not a surprise for me because they were lessons you taught many of us over many years. And so I am excited to get into this. I would like to start with some of the definitions in the book. We're going to come across definitions throughout my notes, but especially here in the start, I think hearing the original words and understanding them is helpful for people, especially non-Arabic speaking people, especially in the West here. And I did send you my notes so you can see what words I've started with here, and if you can help us with these, that would be great.
Absolutely. So I'll start off with sort of the notes in terms of the introduction, right? Like what is referred to as anarchic ijtihad or anarchic ijtihad. So anarchic ijtihad, and just for audience members, that the book goes on Islam and anarchism, and the primary argument that I make is that Islam is inherently anarchistic. I would argue that Black, Indigenous, and people of color traditions are generally anarchistic, right? So as much as even though I identify as a Muslim anarchist, right? I'm addressing anarchism and not necessarily European anarchism, or as it emerged in the 19th century, but rather the fact that it's an audience that exists, absolutely. But I'm also trying to illuminate to anarchists, particularly Euro-American and white anarchists, that there's a lot to learn from Black, Indigenous, and people of color traditions that anteceded anarchism as it emerged, again, as European political philosophy, as a mode of organizing, as a way of looking at power that existed within our traditions prior to that, right? So it's a strategic move in terms of addressing contemporary movements that exist, anarchist movement that exists, that also have a lot of people of color, but also addressing a people of color audience in the most general sense. So ijtihad actually comes from, ijtihad is really critical reasoning. It is cultural consciousness in a certain sense. It is a methodology and a right that every Muslim has access to. Creator has given us a right as Muslims to engage in. There are many verses in the Quran that say or use the words "Ala yatafakkarun, ala yaqilun." Do they not think that they are not reflect, right, upon what it is that they're reading? So Islam is a very critical religion or faith, spirituality, and these are three interrelated but not necessarily the same concepts, right? Because religion doesn't map out directly, because again, as a concept, it was developed by European anthropologists, and it means something in the West that it doesn't necessarily mean in the context of the word, say, deen in Islam, right? Deen in Islam isn't just religion. It's the oral tradition. It's, the agricultural, the artistic, the engineering, the medical, the culinary sort of cultures that are infused within Muslim societies for the span of 1,400 years. So deen is just, it cannot be reduced to the concept of religion, although one can say, okay, there are some synchronities there. The word for spirituality in Arabic is ruhaniya, and the word for faith is iman. Right. And again, these are three interrelated, but they're not one and the same thing. And I can discuss why that becomes relevant to the concept of ijtihad, which is critical thinking. Because in many verses in the Quran, and we need to understand that Arabic is a very beautiful language. It's both noun and verb based. So a lot of Arabic words will involve sort of three-letter roots, right? So ijtihad comes from the root jahada, jim ha dal. Right. And of course, it also relates to jihad, right? Because that shares the same root, right? And there are two types of jihad. There's the greater jihad, which is the struggle against one's own inner privileges, microfascisms in a sense. And of course, jihad in the form of the smaller jihad, which is defensive war. But the actual word for fighting in Islam is not jihad, it's qital. To fight, right? So not all forms of jihad are qital, and not for all forms of qital are necessarily jihad, because you can engage in a war that is unjust, right? That isn't based on social justice, right? Or out of a sense of vendetta or vengeance or whatever it is. Again, not all forms of jihad are qital, simply because you could be engaged in sort of a struggle against your own microfascisms and alongside, your community. So privileges like patriarchy, belonging to particular genders, particular class privileges, sexual privileges or preferences, and so on and so forth. These all involve a form of jihad to counter queerphobia, sexism, patriarchy, classism that exist in all our communities, right? And given the impact of colonialism and imperialism, this is why jihad becomes a mode of critical reasoning. Anybody can engage with it for the simple reason that Islam doesn't have a priesthood. It's not an institutionalized faith. There are religious institutions like Al-Azhar University that I did research at, right? In Egypt that, yeah, extend for a significant number of, for almost a millennium, right? However, at the end of the day, they are not institutions or should not have been institutions because this jihad is a collective act that's supposed to be done by everybody. And everybody completes everybody else's ijtihad because we all cover different elements of the equation in our understanding of the Quran. This becomes very important. Why? Because there are even verses in the Quran that nobody knows the meaning of. So chapter 2 in the Quran, the chapter of the cow, begins with three-letter word, alif, lam, mim, that nobody knows the meaning of. Right? And which is, I always found, and these verses are referred to as the verses of al-ghaib, of the unknown, because this was a way for a creator to humble Arabs who were very much poets, who very much had a command and a certain sense of pride with regards to their own language, but with regards to what they do not know and do not understand and will never come to comprehend and understand in terms of, if you will, creator and non-human life that is a subject, not an object, that is an extension of creator within themselves, right? So, and what creation has to teach us, insofar as the insignificance of our own humanity, in a certain sense, because, well, non-human life doesn't really need us. We need it and require it, right? In so many ways, or her, forgive me, because she's not an object. So that becomes very important so far as jihad and so far as critical reasoning. A lot of verses in the Quran will, for instance, refer and begin as follows. It will not begin as Ya ayyuhal muslimin wal muslimat, or Muslims across genders, right? But rather will say Ya ayyuhal mu'minina wal mu'minat, and hence we draw on the word iman here that I described as faith, because mu'minin is, well, to all believers, believers in a creator and believers in creation. So these verses are to all of humanity, right? Because there are verses in the Quran that say وخلقناكم من شعوب وقبائل لكي تعارفوا وأحسنكم عند الله أتقاكم, which means we have created you from different tribes and different nations, including non-human life, so that you may get to know one another. And the best amongst you, right, are those that exercise social justice, right? Are those that exercise a certain piety in relationship to social justice. So ijtihad really does involve then that critical reasoning, right? We're displaced, we're polyamorous and polymorphous species. We move, we're dynamic, we engage with one another across different lands, across different cultures, across different nations. And hence we are required to engage in an incumbent responsibility to understand and situate ourselves within the geopolitical and local contexts as migrants, as who engage in hijra or hijras that we are, right? So as a displaced Muslim who had to leave Egypt for political circumstances, that doesn't take away from the fact that I'm a settler on stolen land. It's not an element of shyness or something that I feel so guilty with regards to, because that benefits no one. At the end, then what becomes then my responsibility in getting to know the indigenous lands and the indigenous people of these lands who are caretaking it, because that becomes my responsibility, and then connecting vis-a-vis spiritual, vis-a-vis ethical, vis-a-vis political, social justice terms, our communities together, given how our fires are connected and given our mutually intersecting struggles that and a history that goes back to 1492. So I'll just stop there, and then so I can go through the terms. I'm illuminating a little bit of here and that. Thaqafa is critical consciousness and intellect. And again, it's a term that sort of critical consciousness and intellect doesn't really encapsulate, because again, we as Muslims, we have, particularly with modernity, we've come to embrace thaqafat al-naql, which means a culture of repetition as opposed to a culture of critical thinking vis-a-vis ijtihad. So opposed to a culture of the use of the mind. One of the things that Islam often gets mistranslated into, and this is part of the violence of and the politics of mistranslating, because again, English is a noun-based language, and we assume that by saying that every word in another language Arabic or Tutsil or Lakota or whatever it is easily translatable into English, but that's a form of violence within itself, right?
It
It's a
is.
force of violent assimilation within itself, because Islam, a lot of Muslims even say, well, it means submission. Actually, Islam does not mean submission. If we again go back to the three-letter root, and this is part of the critical consciousness, the ijtihad, the thaqafa that we engage in, we find out that it comes from the root sallama, which means to willfully surrender and to willfully share, right? And contribute. So when I say, Krista, please salimini or salimili this plate, means please, like, give me this plate, right? It isn't an act of you submitting to me, rather you have the agency. And this is what submission denies them from an Orientalist translation, Muslims, right? Because what your Americans and Orientalists and conquistadors and so on and so forth and white supremacists wants to give the impression of, whether they're liberals or conservative, is that Muslims are a bunch of mindless people that don't think, and they just bow their heads 5 times to the day, in a day, to Allah, without really critically thinking. They're a bunch of savages and a bunch of heathens that just endlessly repeat dictums that they don't really think. Right? So this is part of the trope that is mixed in. If we translate actually the word submission to Arabic, it comes with a different word, khudu', which means to blindly submit, but that's a different word, right? So Islam actually means to willfully surrender, to surrender upon critical thinking, upon choice, upon reflection, like the other terms that I referred to in the Quran as yatafaqqahuna, yatafakkarun. And the same thing happens with regards to anarchism. When it's mistranslated in Arabic, it's mistranslated all as fawdawiyya, which literally means, well, anarchy and chaos. And again, it's to give the impression that, you know, it's just those things as opposed to self-governance, right? So the actual translation of anarchism in Arabic is la sultawiyya, which means without authority, right? So again, you know, in an Aurelian time, your America projects euphemisms, right? Like, you know, civilians that are referred to as casualties of war, right? Torture is, you know, simulated drowning. CIA kidnappings are extraordinary renditions. This is part of the Orwellian times that we live in. So words and their meanings are stripped away from us, right? One of the ironies is, and you know, maybe it's just worth just giving this historical pretext, right? And this is where the book starts, as you know, that Columbus, when they invaded, when the early conquistadors invaded, you know, the Caribbean and the Americas, right? They referred to the Taino people, right, or to the weapons that were used by the Taino people as alfanjis, which is the Spanish name for the scimitars that Muslim soldiers and warriors were using against the Crusaders. Hernan Cortez, who, as we know, is the Spanish conquistador who overthrew and conquered and genocided sort of the Aztec Empire between 1519 and 21, he referred to Aztec temples as mosques. Like when one goes and reads like their diaries, he referred to actually Aztec women as Moorish women, right? And he even referred to Montezuma, who was the Aztec leader at the time, as a sultan, because these were their points of references insofar as sort of the war that existed at the time between Muslims and Christendom. And because they couldn't conquer Muslims head on, right, they had to in a certain way go around, right, and occupy a certain way. Yeah.
This is fascinating because so when, you know, when white folks, the Spanish, came here and started their conquering, their justification for conquering us was by likening us to you. And nowadays, you know, in American warfare, settler Americans refer to everybody else as Indians, referring to indigenous people in Turtle Island as their justification for conquering everybody else. So it's like come full circle.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look at Iraq. Iraq was being described as Indian land and Indian territory, right? When they were going in, Osama bin Laden, when they caught him, they referred to him, his code name was Geronimo, right? So this is the concept projections. And this is why 1492, from a transatlantic global perspective, becomes very, very vital, because what happened in Andalusia in Spain becomes really important, because we saw the Crusades, particularly underneath the auspices of Ferdinand and Isabel, you know, murder, persecute, forcibly convert Muslims and Jews, because again, they couldn't succeed in a head-on collision, with Muslims whatsoever, right? And I'm not going to romanticize 1,400 years of Muslim history. Muslims have done, a lot of ills to themselves and to others, unfortunately, because they forgot the original message of Islam. So I'm not out to reorientalize or occidentalize Muslim traditions either, right? No society or no people are perfect. Again, when you lose sight of your original instructions, of your original teachings, right, you lose your compass, right? But
We do.
Muslims and Jews were evicted, they were murdered, they were persecuted, and we were referred to as savages and heathen. And here becomes really important, because the savage is the racial categorization, the heathen is the religious categorization, and then that became, so we have to understand this, because this becomes very important, because settler colonialism is again a religious structure, and God we trust on the dollar bill, right? Insofar as the Protestant ethic that guides individuals' conceptualizations of property, insofar as Victorian mores that guide gender and sexual practices and categorizations and references, and so on. And so it's a structure that is religious that way. The Pledge of Allegiance, the Oath of Allegiance that you citizen immigrants have to take, which, will bring us perhaps to the next term, Tawheed, but also the fact that a fifth of the transatlantic slaves in the Middle Passage Black Can were Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula and the west coast of Africa. And so we begin to see a global Islamophobia, then why that continues to persist and why it's foundational to the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so on and so forth, right? Whether it's the Christchurch massacre that we're talking about in so-called New Zealand, and so on and so forth, the mission becomes the same. And the same thing with, and it bears mindful to say that, look, Zionism is a white supremacist manifestation of Judaism, right? As much as Wahhabism is a white supremacist interpretation of Islam, Zionism does not stand in for Judaism, and neither is Wahhabism for Islam, nor is Euro-American Christianity for Eastern Christianity, because all these traditions are traditionally people of color traditions and spiritualities, and so on and so forth, and they're guided by different mores, even if white supremacy has imprinted upon them. But then that brings me to the concept of Tawheed. Tawheed is the Pledge of Allegiance. And here, there's a word that's been circulating the past few days with regards to the word martyr, right? And again, the closest approximation of or translation of that term in Arabic is shaheed. But shaheed doesn't just mean martyr, right? Shaheed can also mean to witness or to testify, right? So, so shaheed comes from, again, the three-letter root shahada, right? And it is the first thing that one does when one bears testimony, pledges allegiance to the sovereignty of Creator. And as Muslims, we are not required to pledge our allegiance or our sovereignty to anything or anyone but Creator, and Creator in Islam is without gender. Allah does not have a particular gender. Okay, so again, so that we're dealing with sort of the sexist undertones that Muslims like to participate in so many ways, just to be honest and
I'd like
very
to
clear.
interject here too, because a lot of times, our words for the great mysteries, whatever, Creator, become Creator. And if you take most translations, a more accurate word is actually creation, and not even Creator as this singular humanist being. It's greater than our understandings, and our understandings of gods, because I come from a polytheist tradition. Like they aren't human forms, and so our actual words would better translate as creation. But yes, please continue, because these things matter.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, in God, Creator, creation has many different names, right? 99 names, actually, right? Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, the most gracious, the most merciful, and all these are sort of, if you will, adjective descriptors that are meant to, make Creator and creation tangible to our insignificant human minds in a way that is somewhat translatable to our psyche, to our understanding. And insofar as, again, our insignificance, our feebleness, our finality in a certain sense, but they're not encapsulated within, singular terms or certain conceptualizations or petty similarities that way. But Tawheed then is fidelity then to creator creation, if you will, that we pledge sovereignty to. So we don't pledge allegiance to a flag, to per se a nation, even our own tribes, to our own blood, to our own families, to our own children. We don't worship money. It is that pledge, right? But nowadays, of course, you see a lot of Muslims worshiping the dollar bill, worshiping, not just 9-to-5 jobs for their survivalist means, but actually worshiping money in the sense of worshiping money, coveting power. We see it within celebrity cultures and woke cultures and so on and so forth, even amongst leftists. But this becomes the idea, right? The individualist impulse, because in Islam, we're born also in the condition of the fitra. It's the opposite of sort of the Euro-American Christian doctrine of original sin. We're born in the condition to actually do good, to connect with community, to connect with our Mother Earth, right? To connect with that which is collectively beneficial, to not hoard, to not want to be selfish, to not want to be authoritarian. We become socialized that way. So it's not a higher wiring that we're born in the condition of sin. Rather, no, we're actually born, given the fact that we existed within our mother's womb, and then there's an extension. When was the I and I? When I was within my mother's womb, we breathed through her. We excreted through her. We ate and fed, and we had no other medium, and so we were one in symbiotic relationship as a we. But it is in that cutting of the umbilical cord that we become individualized that way, right? And again, socialized in particular ways. So Tawheed emphasizes that, if you will, unity of connection, right? With it's ironic that so many chapters, and Muslims don't reflect on it, so many chapters in the Quran, the chapter of the moon, the chapter of the sun, the chapter of the thunder, the chapter of the ant, the chapter of the bee, the chapter of the elephant are named after human life. Literally, and Muslims do not reflect on, again, the historical, material, symbolic, spiritual significance that literally creation is calling out for us insofar as a connection that we are supposed to be, again, in tune with. And yet look at us, we've worshipped, we've learned as Europeans sort of model of, even within the architectures, we built the largest clock tower that overshadows the house of Abraham in Mecca, as if we're out, and skyscrapers, as if we're willing out of these sort of desert nomadic societies, as if we're out to dethrone creator and crown ourselves as demagogues, right? This is sort of the embodiment of us becoming God, right? And the irony of, that Nietzsche tried to point out, that if we kill God, then we become gods, vying for God's displaced in power. And we see it manifested in Tahrir. Oh, we removed the Pharaoh Mubarak. Let us all then become pharaohs, because removing God's, a Pharaoh's space and power does not eliminate power. We just vie and tear each other apart over that space. So Tawheed becomes very central to remind us of what we worship. We don't even worship our own tribes and nations. Why? Because even our own tribes and nations and communities may be astray. They may be deluded. They may be engaging in white supremacy. How many Black and Indigenous, and we could sit down and name names, but we all know them, right?
Yeah.
Within our communities are Black, red, brown-skinned folks with white masks, right? And they've developed this idol worship mentality and bought into white supremacy and assimilation and so on and so forth. Does that mean that we should ostensibly follow them? That becomes the key then. That one doesn't worship, one worships and abides by the ethical, political, spiritual commitments that create and creation stand for. And if you stray from those, that becomes our caliber. That becomes our barometer in which we evaluate each other and our relations and all our relations to one another, right? And this is why, for instance, like a lot of mu'mineen, or a lot of, as I said earlier, a lot of quote unquote non-Muslims are believers. And in this way, also a lot of Muslims are non-believers, because the non-believer in the Quran is described as those who desecrate in the earth, those who engage in fasad, those who engage in corruption, those who don't mind the rights of the poor, of the women, of elderly, and so those who promulgate oppression constantly and continuously, right? So again, that leads to a reimagination, a cosmovision of who and what is a Muslim, of who so-called is a non-Muslim, and our entire belief systems in relationship to everybody else. Which brings me then to, again, a chapter in the Quran and the next concept that you have, which is Surah Al-Shura. There's a chapter called Surah Al-Shura, and Shura means mutual consultation, because again, in Islam, so Tawheed is an anti-authoritarian and non-authoritarian concept within Islam, and it's one of the anarchistic pillars that exist within Islam, because if you don't worship, again, any tribe or any nation, then that's an anarchistic dimension. The second is Shura, which is mutual consultation. What is the point of mutual consultation? Is so that we can engage in reciprocity and mutual aid and mutual exchange. That becomes really important. So if I'm struggling with something in my own personal and even in our collective lives together, I come and engage in mutual consultation with you. It's one thing, for instance, if we live in a home and I would like to, paint my room pink. Right. And another thing, if I want to collapse or want to tear down a wall that is, a bearing wall in home, right? I can't just do that without mutually consulting with you, right? I can't just take a land that belongs to everybody as a community without consulting with you as to how that land would be used together collectively, or a particular, say, ingenuous sort of purpose that I would like to use the land for, because it's not an nepotistic communist approach in the sense of, again, and I don't mean to diss communism, but the nepotism in such a way that our personal sort of ingenuity is hindered, right, in terms of inventing things anew? Or is it the hyper-capitalist individualist approach that I'm going to just take what's mine and that's that? It is a way in which, again, the autonomy of the individual is preserved. If I come up with an idea, if you come up with an idea, then let's talk about it. I might be interested in the same idea. I might be like, you know what, Krista, that's amazing. Go ahead and engage in it. And what resources do you need? And what tools? And how can the community and myself support? And we embark. And hopefully that the initiative benefits all of us, right?
Yeah.
But it's not either or that way. So Shura becomes useful. Shura also exemplifies an act of humility, because if I'm coming to you and I'm seeking advice and counsel, I'm having to humble of my ego in order to come there. And so I'm having to even overcome my insecurities, my fears that I have internalized vis-a-vis white supremacy and colonialism and imperialism and so on and so forth. And that allows for us to actually invest and get to know one another as a community, and that leads to us knowing our conditions and more of a symbiotic relationship, right? And so that also relates to the next concept, which is MAO, which is community consensus, and we become, again, an important part of the process, because if we're talking together, if we're listening to one another and not just hearing one another, then we're able to come to a certain kind of consensus, even if there are disagreements, because there's a saying in Arabic that al-ikhtilaf ليس بضروري ان هو يولد الانشقاق. The disagreements don't or shouldn't necessarily lead to a tearing of one another or a complete rupture in our relationship, because again, there's an ethics by which we should engage in conflict resolution, or what is referred to in Islam as usul al-ikhtilaf, with one another.
My people have a similar concept. So we worked in council, and we had to come to community consensus, and sometimes you cannot agree with your community, but also, even if you could not come to agreement with your community, you still had to decide, like, is my moral responsibility here to keep my community, in this constant conversation, in this constant consultation, or at some point do I need to abstain and withhold for the sake of community? So this was part of consensus. Like, there's times where you keep everybody in circle to figure this out, and there's a time where you might need to say, my disagreement is going to negatively impact community, and for the sake of consensus, I abstain.
Absolutely. That becomes so important to Krista, because we're talking about the difference between strategy and tactic. That was very important to our community. So if we're being attacked, Columbus is landing on the shore, is engaging in conquest, right? We are being attacked, you and I. Okay. From a strategic perspective, of course, we deserve the right to defense, self-defense. So in terms of Shura, we hopefully in consensus, we arrive at at that state. Now, the tactic would be, or the discrepancy could be, well, do we use, a knife? Do we push them? Do we use a gun? Do we use this tactic or that? There may be disagreements over that. This is why it becomes really important then of gaining a certain consensus with regards to strategic issues and understanding the need for prioritizing the community, which brings us to the next concept, which is maslaha, because the public interest and the interest of the community should supersede the whims of the individual in narcissistic terms, particularly if we're talking about communal affairs. We are not talking about me painting my room pink. We're talking about the house that we built together collapsing, or that we live in together collapsing, or somebody and an enemy on our shore that is out to commit genocide against us. Right? So we're talking about a communal dimension here, something that will affect all and not something that is just privy to a single individual and whatever it is that they may desire or they may fancy within themselves. It is something that has a ripple effect and consequences on everybody. So even in situations when we think about, say, divorce, right? And of course, there's so many different dimensions of this, right? In terms of Islam and so far as gender and so far as sexuality and so on and so forth. But even in divorce, the Quran very clearly states that although, it is not disliked because it can disrupt communities ultimately, but it's okay as long as there's amicability, as long as there's consensus, and warns, don't engage in backbiting, don't engage in the other things that happen when relationship collapses, because that has a ripple effect on the rest of community. Of course, if there's abuse, if there's this and that, of course, these need to be addressed. That doesn't mean that they should be swiped underneath the rug so that the community can go on. No, they need to be addressed care up and front and center, but it means that, again, community should be prioritized. Ultimately, children that are in a relationship, that there are so many different ripple effects and ramifications that come from a societal level and from a community level. And there are many reasons by which people disagree. They can disagree out of ego, out of selfishness, out of ignorance, right? Out of actually thinking that they're listening to one another, but what they're actually doing is hearing one another and preparing a reaction or response. And this is how it's different. And this is why a lot of BIPOC feminists have long told us that, listening requires our emotional labor, which is a source of intelligence within itself, our patience for us not to be reactionary that way, and so on. And that's part of dismantling patriarchy that men need to learn, and part of the growth and the maturing that men particularly need to engage in. So the ultimate interest then becomes that maslaha vis-a-vis the ummah. So all these are anti-authoritarian concepts, maslaha, ijma', tawheed. But also then we're talking about, besides sovereignty, right? Then how does the manifestation of sovereignty, or what is the manifestation of sovereignty in terms of political governance? How does it manifest in terms of Islam? And it manifests through the concept of ummah. Ummah traditionally is sort of the global polity. It's not territorial. It's not tied to one particular land, because, again, Islam's message is universal, unlike Judaism, right? Judaism universal. Its message isn't based on a tribe or a group. It is to everybody in the world, and not to conquer them or to make Muslims or quote-unquote non-Muslims Muslims, because, again, there are many paths to the same creator, and Islam acknowledges over 180,000, if not 200 in certain accounts, 300,000 different messengers and prophets that were sent to all kinds of different tribes and nations and people with the same message. But because different nations and tribes have different cultures, different ways of being, sometimes the message needs to be framed differently, right? To different people. And that is part of the
understanding.
Part of the mercy, actually, of creation and creator, if you will, to our species, right? But then the ummah becomes then a manifestation of a global community of Muslims and so-called non-Muslims living together. And what binds these communities together is this social justice, ethical, political commitments, and spiritual commitments that they share. So even though they become from different traditions. So again, let me take so it's based on the Medina Charter, which is the first charter that the Prophet, peace be upon him, had established, right? Muslims, Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, Sabians, all kinds of people, even polytheists, were part of that right? And that becomes very important to recognize. Now, we need to also understand that because of white supremacist imprints on Islam, ISIS has its own idea of the ummah that is totalitarian. For instance, ISIS doesn't even consider Al-Qaeda to be Muslim, although they're from the same sort of sect or branch, Sunni Islam. I don't identify with any particular sect or whatever, because all these interpretations are beautiful insofar as they complement one another and complete one another. And I have issues with each and every single one. And ultimately, I just call myself a Muslim, right? So I'm a Sufi and a Shiite in certain respects, and, you know, a Sunni in other respects, and so on and so forth, right? But anyways, and they all arose because one segment of Islam excluded others. Anyways, this is why new interpretations come up, right? So, but my point being is that, you know, the original Ummah included Daesh has its own interpretation of an ummah that includes even militants and conservatives as al-Qaeda, right? Liberal Muslims have their own interpretation of Islam's that is very the ummah that is very flaky, right? And it's based on sort of homo-nationalism, pinkwashing, settler colonialism, this multicultural melting pot of world where we're all hyphenated Americans, so to speak, right? And not taking into consideration settlerhood. So this is why I also say that that's the limit of identity politics from a strategic perspective, because just because somebody calls themselves a Muslim doesn't mean, or indigenous or a black, doesn't make them a part of my ummah, because it's just like, okay, you're indigenous, but what are the ethical political commitments that ground your indigeneity, or black or whatever? Because you could be black and Zionist, you could be indigenous and Zionist, you could be Muslim and Zionist, and there are many of those around. And we see them outing themselves a lot these days, right? Be they from conservative perspectives or liberal.
It's not lost on me that most of the indigenous folks outing themselves as Zionists are the same indigenous folks who have bought into not only capitalism, but into the settler colonial state, working for part of the settler colonial state. It is no wonder that these are the indigenous folks who have forgotten the red path because they have accepted these assimilation ideas. And even those who maybe haven't, like, when we talk about words and how, you know, Europeans, as in white folks, wherever they might live now, have like changed our ideas and our understandings of words. Like here on Turtle Island in the residential schools, they not just taught them Christianity, but they made up indigenous stories and teachings to teach us that were not actually ours, but we didn't know because we were children. And these things have come into our understanding. These Christian understandings have been like input into indigenous ideas as traditional teachings that are not traditional teachings. And they're there because they do two things. They either rechange our understanding of our own words or concepts, or they bring in these ideas that will stop us from resisting. They bring in pacifistic ideas. Anyway, continue.
Or they like to do what, you know, is Shireen Razak and Vida Laurier, you know, had noted, Junior, of, you know, may he rest in power, had noted of playing Indian grandmother syndrome, right? Like like Nancy Reagan, like Elizabeth Warren, like Andrea Smith. I mean, there are so many, right? That exist, right? As some Orientalist again, you know, take on their own self as a way to whitewash away their complicity again within insofar as ongoing indigenous genocide and dispossession. So the next term that you had, and, you know, we're continuing on obviously with the conversation about sort of the politics of mistranslation, is Dawda. So this goes to show you that, you know, how colonized Arabs and Muslims in particular have become, right? And they may read the Quran again in every single prayer. They may read it during Ramadan as much as they want, and so on and so forth, but they fundamentally don't understand. And we have lost our understanding of our own language, right? And growing up as a Muslim with an elder that was over 100 and something years old, it was really beautiful, because before I was taught to memorize the Quran, I was taught to actually understand it, to apply it, right? It's about, as should be, intent, purpose, and action. Intent, purpose, and translation of that action, right? But the word Dawda, if you ask any Arab or Muslim right now, What is the word for state in Arabic? The first thing that they will say is dawla. Dawla, though, does not mean state, right? That's a very dehistoricized view, because an Islamic state never existed, because the concept of a state is a Euro-American construct, right? It is an invention by the West of how, as a form of political governance, and we can talk about the different types of states, settler states, post-colonial states, that mimic that Western kind of governance, because states are not this abstract entity that exists, as we said, over and above us. Rather, we already govern one another vis-a-vis the asymmetries of power. But they're hierarchical, right? They are a mode of racializing, of gendering, of controlling, not just disciplining societies. They are our actual Oedipal father, right? They breed authoritarianism within us, right? And capitalism acts as sort of an Oedipal mother, because to her, nothing is sacred, right? Pride is celebrated with, corporate, Heineken flags and bottles, in the background, and so on, and hypersexualization sort of modalities that govern it, that are very, nothing is sacred to capitalism, right? Valentine's Day, you go buy a Hallmark card, Che Guevara on a t-shirt, a symbol of anti-capitalist resistance on a shirt, right? And that's not to take away from, certain dimensions and shortcomings of Che insofar as like misogyny or whatever else, because again, we shouldn't really romanticize anybody in particular, as much as he was a revolutionary, no doubt, and a martyr, all right, for a cause. But there is no term for state in Arabic, and so even the idea of an Islamic state is ludicrous, right? So the medieval conceptualization of dawla is often mistranslated that way. Arab nationalists, for instance, will use the dawla as a post-colonial term to refer to individual Arab states, right? They will as الدولة العربية, الدولة المصرية العربية, right? Or the word Syria العربية, the Arab Syrian Republic, the Egyptian Arab dawla or state, and so on and so forth. Even ISIS referred to itself as a Dawla al-Islamiyya. So look at this. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who graduated out of the University of Baghdad with a PhD in Islamic studies, couldn't even wrap his head besides replicating that very idea that such a thing as an Islamic state existed. So this distorts, though, Dawla's intended linguistic and material meaning as it emerged out of a violent and sort of forceful desire by Arabs and Muslims to develop their own discourses, their own languages in relationship to European liberal sort of patriarchal nation-state projects, right? That we internalized that we had to have a word for state. But the truth is, dawla stems from the two verbs, dal, right, which morphically as well as semantically means to fall, and another verb, which is to rotate, right? And a third verb, actually, which is zal, right, to go away. So its meaning revolves precisely around sort of the notions of temporality, change, rotation, as opposed to a fixed order, which is what states do. They have borders, right? And this is how we arrive at border imperialism, to use Harsha Walia's sort of term, right? It means the discipline of controlling who comes in, who is a foreigner, who's an alien, who's allowed to be on this land, who's not allowed, citizenship rights, discourses, passports, and so on and so forth. Again, pinpoint what's your age, what's your name, where are you from, background, gender, religion, and so on, to be identifiable to the machina of white supremacy, to the structure of white supremacy. But then temporality and succession are essential to the dawla. Like the dawla refers to, at least from a Quranic and Arabic linguistic perspective, anything that's circulated from one hand is a dawla. It could also refer to as a condition of well-being for a person or a group. And we know conditions of well-being that sooner or later, one day you have your health, another day you don't. Some days you're happy, some days you're sad. So the 59th chapter of the Quran, Surah Al-Hashr, the chapter of the gathering, verse 7, for instance, refers to the dawla as in the context of the Prophet's distribution of the spoils of war to those that are in need, right? When they were fighting their oppressors, right? So that it does not circulate, so that the spoils of war do not remain within sort of elite privileged hands that way, right? So that it does have circulation or dawlatun amongst you, right? And not remain amongst those that are privileged. In another chapter, the third chapter of the Quran, the chapter of the house of Imran, or the family of Imran, verse 140, it refers to the cyclical nature of human vicissitudes. One day it's triumphant, another day is full of defeat. So the very meaning of dawla was distorted by Arabs and by Muslims. And it's ironic because it's a term that's used in the Quran. And even in pre-modern times, again, the Ummah was what provided sovereignty, right? So, and even if we look at dawlas, there existed multiple dawlas, right, within one loose decentralized confederacy, within, again, the ummah itself. Because a dawla by definition cannot found an ummah, seeing that the ummah as an idea is the purpose behind a dawla in the first place. And again, a dawla at the time refers to any political, spiritual interpretation that was put forth by either an individual or community members that then took privilege within particular landscapes of a certain territories. This is why you sometimes had several dawlas within the same ummah, because there are contestation insofar as a multiple set of interpretations amongst different collectivities of Muslims going on at the same time. And this allowed actually for these interpretations and these dawlas to be challenged, because you didn't have nation states, you didn't have surveillance structures. If you came up with a better interpretation, you challenged any kind of impulse towards despotic rule. And this is why, for instance, the Hamdanite, the Bu'ayyid, the Kshidi, the Ayyubi, and the Mamuli dawlas existed within the Abyssinian sort of ummah and period. Muhammad Ali and Ali Bey Kibir's dawlas existed within sort of the Uthmani period and Uthmani ummah at the time. The fact that you had an Umayyad sort of ummah does not mean that you literally had a seat in Damascus, let alone that there was a Syria, right? And the same token that the fact that you had an Abbasid ummah did not mean that it had a seat in Baghdad and that you had an Iraq or an Iraqi caliphate. But the point being that, dawla is unfortunately misunderstood that way. And part of the reason is that a lot of Muslims were lost after the Prophet, peace be upon him, died. And the Prophet never had any sons. His sons actually died shortly after birth. He only had women, girls, right, as daughters. And the reason that is, elaborated and discussed actually is that Islam is not a hereditary faith that way, that you have to choose. And this was a way to circumvent the idea that anybody would just claim, as happens in Jordan. I mean, the king of Jordan, the king of Morocco claim to be descendants of the Prophet. And there are many descendants of the Prophet. I mean, my mother has a certificate that we're descendants of the Prophet, peace be upon him, right? And a branch of the prophetic lineage. But it delineates the idea that, just because I'm a descendant of the Prophet, that can lead to despotic rule that way, that my uncle is the Prophet or my great ancestors, that allows me some kind of legitimacy then to then act in authoritarian ways and to claim Islam as the mantle is for my own. So that, that is the concept of dawla, and which takes us to a related concept, which is...
Can I ask then?
Oh, of course. Please.
Dawla be more like an alliance between ummas?
It's not an alliance between ummas, because remember, dawlas exist within ummas and they can't find ummas, because an ummah an ummah is whatever image that Muslims decide it to be. Like even the ummah could be a single individual. Like Abraham was described as an ummah unto himself. Why? Because Abraham was in a certain sense one of the first believers, and nobody wanted to believe. Nobody wanted to believe in him or in the message that Abraham was carrying. So he was alone ummah unto himself. And a dawla is, as you described, though, a political spiritual fusion. Like, for instance, Saudi Arabia, right, is built on Wahhabism. What is it? It was a particular tribe in Saudi Arabia was elevated to a certain stance and stature by British colonizers to usurp the rights of other Arabian tribes in alliance with Mohamed Abdul Wahab, who was a conservative theologian. The politics was necessary to fuse with the theology to provide political spiritual justification for why, again, that fusion and people underneath them need to follow that particular manifestation of that fusion. Does that make sense? So again, this is why social justice is inseparable from politics, and politics is inseparable. This is why we always talk about sort of the role of political theology, and even Kwame Ture and Malcolm did it, Martin Luther did it, and so on and so forth, right? And this is why we need to think about their messages, because, the idea that, again, well, if settler colonialism is secular, if the land isn't secular, then by what means can we claim per se to be secular? Because again, then, social justice is a spiritual act. Land is a spiritual act. How we connect to, again, creation without being spiritual ourselves and without buying into the dogma of authoritarian and institutionalized religion, because that's not necessarily the case either. Which brings me to the next concept that's related to ijtihad, it's related to shura, it's related to ijma', it's related to the ummah, which is the concept of khulafa. Many times this term appears in the Quran in the plural form. right? That we are all khulafa, which means we're caretakers of the land. It doesn't exactly translate into stewards of the land, because again, that assumes or can give the impression that we're over the land, that we live on the land as opposed to with the land, which is very different. We live with the land, or we're supposed to live with the land, not on it. But we are caretakers with the land. We are caretakers of it, right? And
It's a
we're all khulafa.
responsibility to be a caretaker. It's
Exactly,
not an
exactly.
authority, it's a responsibility.
Exactly, exactly. But again, as many concepts within Islam, this has become fused or infused with a certain understanding that there needs to be one Khalifa or one ruler, which is a huge problem. And this emerged after the Prophet, peace be upon him, died. So this is my reading, and I talk about this a little bit in the after the Prophet, peace be upon him, while he was on his deathbed, right? The Prophet was asked who should lead us, right? And his response was, let Abu Bakr, who was one of his dearest friends and who had become a Muslim, lead you in prayer. But in saying that, Muslims at the time, and this is what Muslims fail to understand, that Abu Bakr needed Omar, who was another companion of the Prophet, needed Ali, and needed Uthman. All these were, if you will, community members, and so were the Prophet's wives, because they had a role well, and they were khulafa as well, whose opinions mattered, right? So they weren't they were more, if you will, if you want to translate it, they were somewhat temporary leaders, because they were all also assassinated, right? Like 3 out of the 4 of them were assassinated. And the reason is, again, they weren't some kind of rulers that were walking around with a bunch of entourages sitting in palaces or whatever. And they always conducted themselves because they had internalized a certain revolutionary character. And they had different temperaments too, Krista, which becomes very important. Abu Bakr was known as the sweet and gentle-hearted and honest and trustworthy that way, as were certain characteristics of all of them, really the Prophet. But he was described as sort of very soft-hearted and very sweet and very kind. Umar was described as someone who was zealot of Islam, right? So he had such a jealousy over Islam, so sometimes he'd be quick to react. He represented sort of the more militant wing, right? Ali was sort of the door to knowledge, right? So he was the youngest. He was the Prophet's cousin, and he was married to the Prophet's daughter, but he was referred to as the door of wisdom. So he was just very calm, very collected, and very wise beyond his years. Uthman kan Sakhi, he was very generous. So again, even in their temperaments and their qualities, they all complemented one another, right? And the same thing, this is why even Aisha, the wife of the Prophet, was able to face even Ali on the battlefield during the Battle of the Camel, because when Uthman, one of the companions of the Prophet, was murdered, Ali, in order to prevent dissension and sedition within the community, said, let us just, forgive the murder. Let us not split the community apart and tear each other apart. And she actually went at Ali on the battlefield. It's referred to as the Battle of the Camel. They never actually went to full-on war because they managed to, again, come to consensus. But this is why they were all khulafat that way. Unfortunately, Muslims now think that, well, no, there needs to be one ruler. And again, I want to distinguish between being a leader in a certain sense or assigned a leadership position and being a ruler. Because look, even when the Prophet said, let Abu Bakr lead you, every Muslim knows in prayers, right? Every Muslim knows that a person that leads prayer in one prayer is not necessarily the same person that leads prayer in another. And that allows for a rotation, if you will, not only of leadership position, but because if I got out of line, if I got proven to be sexist or authoritarian or queerphobic, or acted in one way in public, but was hypocritical in the way that I dealt with people within my own household, in my own privacy, right? If I abused women in my household and so on and so forth, and that got exposed, I should not, because there are certain qualities that a leader should, quote unquote, be abided by. And again, that position is temporary, only for a particular period of time. And hence, we're capable of rotating because, again, ultimately, we're all leaders and we're all supposed to uplift one another. And this is why ijtihad is a collective act. When I would lead prayers on Friday prayers, a lot of older and younger, but I really would remember the older ones would come to me and would ask me deep personal questions about, things like, I mean, it's weird, right? Like cunnilingus, right? And like oral sex or intimate questions, right? With regards to, their significant others and so on and so forth. And because I feared this element of being placed in a position of like authority, power, whatever, right? My way of disseminating that power back, saying, listen, there is this view in Islam and this view from this perspective and this view and this view. Go read, go do your jihad, go do your own critical thinking, engage in consensus with your significant other, and do what you feel comfortable with. Right? But that's what I can tell you. I'm not going to dictate to you then, what you should be doing. There are different opinions. Go read about the different opinions and go engage then, because this is part of the mercy and the beauty that we are allowed to think and reflect and that is a way for us to take responsibility for an action, as opposed to, when I think about the Tahrir, right? Part of the crisis, because the state operates vis-a-vis a politics of rights, not a politics of responsibility, right? Everybody vies for each other's, right? Like you and I get into a car accident, right? And so we're going to call the cops. We're going to call the insurance companies, the, slave catchers and the corporations to come resolve us, because we can't figure out our differences or disagreements or whatever as khulafa in relationship to one another. But what happens when we bear responsibility? In the 18 days in Tahrir Square, we literally were scrubbing the streets of Tahrir. We were feeding one another. We broke down gender boundaries. Women were, quote unquote, manning checkpoints because we took up a politics of responsibility. But we didn't continue with that revolutionary responsibility because we wanted to throw that responsibility back on the garbage collector, back on the state to, police us, to decide our daily affairs, right? Back on corporations to give us our sense of security and sustenance and so on and so forth, right? Because we didn't have an alternative way of being, or at least we didn't imagine and in a certain sense, if you will, castrated, if you erased our own modes, our own native forms of governance, our own nodes of traditions, because we had to go back to this idea of the state taking care of us, right? And mitigating our relations. So,
I've been told that, consensus, consultation, council, its difficulty is it takes too much time to leave room for capitalism. And this is part of why we struggle to do it, because it takes too much time, and we don't have time for capitalism and our 8-hour jobs and our shopping and so on and so forth.
This is where we caught in the logic. Yeah, sorry.
Of chief have been likewise distorted, right? For some indigenous communities on Turtle Island, their role of chief was not a leader, but the orator of the community's consultations. They orated the final decisions. And amongst my people, a chief was just somebody who carried a lot of knowledge in a particular area. And so when we would have council, you might go sit by one of the chiefs whose ideas you most agreed with to help get your ideas out there into the council, rather than necessarily every single person talking. You talk with one of the chiefs who help put your ideas out there, and then in that way they also become an orator. But like, we also didn't have a chief, like we didn't have a leader. We could, if 6 people were like incredibly wise in the area of hunting, then you would have 6 hunting chiefs, if and so on and so forth. And the reservation system with its chief and council system changed that to reflect this idea of singular leaders who were in charge and who would dictate. And the US theorized that by introducing a chief and council system, it would facilitate our acceptance of capitalism. And back to community consultation, consensus does not leave room for capitalism.
It's really amazing that you share that, because when I think about what I was mentioning with regards to the political sort of and spiritual fusion that happened there is a huge debate, and I get into this across Muslims, is what is exactly then the authority of, even if there was a singular Khalifa? And this was the whole state of confusion that confused Muslims within itself. What exact are they, an executioner of political decision that comes out of the community? But what gives them the religious authority or the religious knowledge? Because they may not have access to the spiritual or oratory oral traditions, or be well versed with regards to them as sort of a transmitter of the knowledge, right? So there are so many different debates about who exactly is it, right? The holder of, again, the spiritual tradition within itself, or is it the person that is executing a particular political decision that has come and arrived to vis-a-vis consensus from the community within itself, right? But this is part of, again, us abandoning our original instructions and gradually feeding into our own despotism, right? That no, there has to be a single person, because we're focusing on surviving. We're not focusing on thriving, right? Surviving is a reactionary act. As much as resistance is a reactionary act, liberation is an active stance, and thriving is an active stance. And when we think about the Zapatistas, for instance, this is where, if you will, the revolutionary laws, including the women's revolutionary laws, in a certain sense, if you will, a resurrection of the original instructions becomes very vital and important, because of the element of consensus, because of the element of everybody being able to voice. And even if there are temporary sort of moments in which there are manifestations of certain, I don't want to even say hierarchies that are established, like with the EZLN, but it's not one that is static, because the EZLN is not an institutionalized army. It is a war machine in the sense that positions are constantly changing, right? Even among sort of the cadre of warriors that they are, because they're also farmers. They're caretakers of the land, and they're women and men and across genders and two-spirit and so on and so forth, right? And not that they call themselves two-spirit, but because the Zapatistas speak in the language of other laws, right? And this is part of going to their own traditions and not even trying to appropriate even terms of queerness and trying to make them their own and so on and so forth. They're using their own traditional languages. But this point of self-organizing, if you will, before even emerging on the scene in 1994, actually a community and a peoples and nations getting to know themselves and building alternatives in terms of medicine.
It took them about 10 years, correct, to be formed enough to be able to create a community that could function and provide for itself and defend itself.
And it's very funny because, some people discern who Marcos is, or Subcomandante Marcos. I mean, now he's called Subcomandante Moises, but discern, when Marcos went down, and he said this, and our word is our weapon, and he admitted this, because by all intents and means, he was a university professor. And in his mind, when he was going to join the Zapatistas, he's like, oh, I'm going to go, transform them into Marxists. And the response of the indigenous people was, no. You need to reevaluate that entire discourse, that entire ideology. And no, you're not out to convert us. And Marx said it himself, they were the ones that converted me, right? Because they taught me that my power and my original teachings and instructions, etc., even as a mestizo, right, of mixed background, they taught me my indigenous roots, right? And the fact that we have our governance order that we should take pride in, right? And don't necessarily, they may even transcend and exceed. And this is not to bash Marxism. Marxism has lots to teach a lot of different people and so on and so forth. But again, this comes to show the manifestation of how we need to go back to our original traditions and instructions and so on and so forth. That doesn't mean that we don't learn.
They're more complete. Our original instructions are more complete than Marxism, which is inherently racist and colonial, or Euro-philosophical anarchism, because what both roots came from was white colonizers looking at BIPOC folks throughout the world and being like, oh, that's kind of cool. I'm going to write it up in my own idea without fully understanding it, without ever understanding its place within a complete societal structure of understandings of lands and sexualities and genders and all and spiritualities. It ignored all those things. And so these European constructs that are Euro-philosophic anarchism and Marxism are incomplete theories. and they're incomplete, and they're inherently based in white supremacy and colonialism. It would be because of what they have left out from their superior understandings. So I will often bash the two. Although I will call myself an anarchist, I will often clarify I'm an indigenist, and anarchism is a part of that. But yeah, you can be polite. I am definitely never being the polite one amongst us.
Look at, well, I have my moments of impoliteness too when I'm dealing with, white Euro-American Marxists or anarchists for that matter. Look, there are Black radical traditions. Yeah, I mean, we have Kwame Ture, we have Patrice Lumumba, we have, Walter Rodney. We have, again, amazing Pan-Africanist Black Marxist thinkers. But the limitation, I think, exposed insofar as, again, the question of the state, the question of power. The Panthers took on a Marxist perspective, and the Panthers were very incredibly radical. But then the pitfalls, and this is why a lot of, Black Panthers have now become anarchists, like Ashanti Alston, my elder, who's a Panther anarchist, right? Lorenzo Irvin, William C. Anderson, a Black anarchist. And there are many anarchist traditions that way, right? Indigenous anarchist, I mean, Gord Hill, and so on and so forth that have been put forth by all kinds of different, again, indigenous people, by spiritual anarchists and so on. But that involves actually decolonizing, including, again, the framework of the state, because that's the pitfall. The pitfall was, of course, the Panthers built their alternatives, their breakfast schools, their hospitals, they armed themselves and so on and so forth. But there was also patriarchy, but there was also queerphobia, and there was the element of hierarchy that made it easier to dismantle the organization and the movement that way. And this is what Marxism isn't attuned to insofar as how power functions, because power is fluid. What the state does, and this is the illusion behind the fact that the people would think that the state is an instrument of liberation, let alone a Stettler state, because it can't. How are you supposed to deal with the military, the pharmaceutical, the agrochemical, the prison to school nexus and pipeline, and so on and so forth? These are entire industrial complexes. In what world are you supposed to take them over? Or they're going to allow you to usurp them or take them over, whether you're Cornel West or Jeremy Corbyn, or whether you're so-called, soft Zionist imperialist that outed himself, Bernie Sanders, right? But even from that perspective, is that it's
you
ultimately
called Bernie Sanders out years ago, though. I remember you telling me years ago.
And the squad,
he's a Zionist.
And the squad too, because they feed into settler colonialism. This is the problem, right? And again, I don't mean to come down or to digress, but even somebody like Ilhan Omar, right, a Somali immigrant woman, right? She's in Black Lives Matter during the height of the Black Spring, right? She starts off her speech by saying, this country was founded on genocide. Actually, it's an ongoing genocide, sister. But go on. She's like, and slavery. Actually, it's afterlife to slavery projects, right? Stand your ground law, school, again, school to prison nexus, all that, right? And then she says, well, look at me. I'm an example of the American dream. You're a settler. The only people that don't get to call them no. And instead of interviews, she was asked, who are your heroines or your heroes, right? And she says, well, Madeleine Albright, one of the architects of the Iraq War and the Oil for Food program. And in another, she refers to what's her name, Margaret Thatcher, right? The mother of neoliberalism, right? So unfortunately, again, that doesn't take away from the anti-Blackness, the false, and Jewish sentiments that are cast on to her, and so on and so forth. But it does show the limitation of that particular political assimilatory trajectory of fitting into, again, the so-called state model. We had Debbie Haaland is indigenous. Look at the anti-Blackness that exists there, and look at how she's treated Afro-Indigenous people, etc. And we've had even vice presidents that are indigenous, and so on. That has not changed the equation. That does not fundamentally structure. You don't change the structure. The
I agree.
Structure
I think that people are always like, oh, we need an indigenous prime minister, an indigenous president. The day that happens, we've lost. That the day that happens, we have been completely assimilated. Our hopes are lost.
Yeah. So that becomes the problem, is that we're dealing with a structure, and we need to understand that we're not dealing with an event. We're not dealing with a set of individuals that therefore are going to change any one thing in particular, because again, that's a band-aid solution for collapsing building. So that, that becomes really fundamental important. And that was sort of the pitfall, if you will, of, Black Marxist traditions, of not understanding that this will never be an instrument of liberation that way, because again, cis heteropatriarchy is coded into it. Racialized codifications exist in a gender, sexuality. It's a hierarchical structure. It cannot. And what states do is that they crystallize power. If power is fluid and dynamic, then I should keep it that way. But if I institutionalize it, what a good example is? When I'm at the Neoliberal Academy, the Ivory Tower, the hierarchical institution, the settler institution that I'm at, right? As a professor, and as much as I try to dismantle sort of the hierarchies of oppression and the fact that I'm a professor, I'm still in a position of authority when I go into the classroom, because I have to hand student marks. I sort of say, well, what the readings are going to be, my responsibilities are to, try and keep it a safe space, although there is no safe space, and so on and so forth. Now, students possess agency. They may walk out of the classroom. They may say, fuck you, I'm dropping the course. They may, issue a complaint against me, they can do all kinds of things, but that's their agency, because nobody's completely stripped out of agency and out of choice that way, right? But outside the classroom, right, their agency even expands multiple folds, because they don't need to listen to me. There's nothing that obligates them, but it's the institution, and then being within the academy, my needing to make a living, them needing to go and learn, right? That compels us into this relationship whereby power, can be loaded, it's ultimately crystallized in such a way that, in a hierarchical fashion. So at the end of the day, if I disagree with somebody in a position of authority, even if they are a leftist, and look at Obrador, right? Look at AMLO, and look at what they're doing to the Zapatistas, right? Like Gustavo Esteva himself said, who is my elder, AMLO does not represent real change, right? Ultimately, he is somebody who is clamping down on the Zapatistas as we speak via the use of paramilitaries, via the use of, the army and so on, and the drug cartels, in order to really eliminate. I mean, the Zapatistas even issued a statement, if you don't mind me reading it, just because I have it up. They say, we will stand up to what comes, in terms of, whoever comes to power, including a leftist president, because we will not allow this project of destruction to be implemented here, i.e. within the La Cundana jungle. We are not afraid of his National Guard. And they're saying this to AMLO, right? To Obrador, which is just an army underneath another name. He renamed it so that so he wouldn't have to admit it's the same army as always. If Mother Earth could speak, she'd say, fuck off. Mother Earth doesn't speak, but if she did, she'd say, no, go fuck yourself. This is Subcomandante Moise of the Zapatista sort of liberation army talking to Lopez Obrador. So this becomes the problem, right? When we see what is happening within Latin America, the so-called pink wave, of Maduro, of all that, right? Again, all these are revolutionaries, but this is the difference between Che and Castro. When you allow your revolutionary project to be usurped and hierarchized into the form of the state, that shows the limits of your revolutionary project, because the revolutionary project is supposed to be ongoing and horizontal and egalitarian, right? And this is what takes away from the possibility of challenging those in power. Now, somebody would say, well, that argument is, well, that feeds into the narrative of imperialism and interventionism. It's like, listen, can't we walk and chew gum at the same time? My choices as a Muslim will not be a Zionist, Wahhabi, Saudi Arabian, crusading alliance that is Euro-American, or a totalitarian, Russian, Chinese project either. I'm sorry. Those are not going to be my choices as a person of color. I refuse that. But this is also the difference between strategy and tactic. When you ask me about, for instance, Syria or Iran, of course, I'm not with the mullahs, but please, at this point, if you ask me about Syria before in 2016 and before, I'd say, please, yes, Bashar al-Assad is the butcher of Damascus. He still is the butcher of Damascus, right? But because the imperialist project wants to divide Syria into different territories, the Sunni, the Shia, and the Kurds, because of their plans with regards to Iran, I say, please keep them in power until we know and understand what exactly alternative projects we've actually accepted. Again, the Zapatistas developed the alternatives before they emerged on the scene, because this is where imperialism thrives. But this is why I say, again, we can walk and chew gum. And the fact that I'm criticizing, yes, white supremacy in Euro-America, because look, China replicates Islamophobia against the Uyghur. Russia replicates Islamophobia against the Chechens. Even Buddhist Myanmar replicates it against the Rohingya. Zionists replicate Islamophobia insofar as majority Muslim population in Palestine. And of course, Christians get usurped into that because of how Islamophobia functions. And so on, and even Jewish Palestinians and so on. Like, which of Islamophobias do you want me to ally on? And to combat? I'm out to combat all of them, whether it's the Euro-American or whether it's the other one. Everybody is imprinted with this Islamophobia and this white supremacy. So this becomes the problem. And again, it builds on the fantasy that you can actually separate racial capitalism from the nation state. You can't, historically you can't, because they both needed one another. And although they may share short-term animosities, their long-term strategic interests are one and the same. And this is, so it's impossible. So even when Trump was saying, oh, well, swamp, he was getting to a point, which is, it's a revolving door between capital and economy and politics. There is no distinction between both anymore. You had some semblance of a welfare state, but that has long disintegrated a very long time ago with the deregulation campaigns and so on and so forth. And and that was the whole goal of NAFTA that actually the Democrats had started and liberals had started, not right-wing conservatives. So in so many ways, liberals are more dangerous. So just to situate that, I guess, in terms of our conversation with regards to just concepts in chapter 2, is, you know,
before we go into chapter 2, I would like to stop this because I will definitely need to break up these recordings. So, all right.
Can I go to the washroom real quick?